My boyfriend's friend told him I wasn't smart enough for him because I was only a lab tech. So I ruined her entire career. You know that feeling when someone you love, someone you've built your entire world with, suddenly starts seeing you as less than, all because of some manipulative outsider? And what if that outsider turned out to be a complete fraud? I had to choose. Let it shatter me or shatter her. Nathan and I, we were a perfect match. 2 years, two aerospace engineers who clicked over trivia, hiking, and late-night documentaries. We'd cook, talk shop, bounce ideas off each other. It was this easy, comfortable rhythm, just genuinely enjoying each other's minds. But then Melissa, a high school friend of Nathan's, re-entered the picture. She was getting her PhD in theoretical physics, and suddenly our cozy hangouts became trio events. At first, I really tried to be friendly. She'd launch into quantum mechanics, and I'd ask questions, genuinely interested. But she'd always answer like she was talking to a 5-year-old, then turn to Nathan with a smirk and say, "Wasn't it cute how she tried to understand?" It felt like a jab, but I noticed she only did it when he was watching. Dinners would become monologues about her research, followed by a condescending apology for boring me with smart people stuff. Me. I have 2 master's degrees, for crying out loud. The real turning point, the one that still makes my blood boil, happened at trivia night. The category was space exploration. This is literally my job, designing satellite components. I aced every single question. Melissa, though, she leaned over to Nathan and whispered loud enough for me to hear. She probably just memorized facts without understanding them. And Nathan agreed. He actually said, maybe we should give other teams a chance. My jaw nearly hit the floor. After that, it was like a switch flipped in Nathan. He started questioning everything. I fixed our router, and he asked if I really knew what I was doing or just got lucky. I helped him optimize some code for his project, and he went behind my back to Melissa, who, of course, told him there were errors. There weren't. Not a single one. The absolute breaking point was Nathan's company party. I was deep in conversation with his boss about propulsion systems when Melissa sashayed over. Without missing a beat, she told his boss I was Nathan's girlfriend, who works as a lab tech. His boss looked confused. A lab tech? I thought you were the engineer who published that paper on thermal management. Melissa just laughed a cruel, dismissive sound and said, "Oh, that must be someone else with her name. The math in that paper is pretty advanced." I tried to correct her, but she'd already pulled Nathan away, beaming. In the car home, I was seething. Nathan, oblivious, started talking. He said Melissa was worried about our compatibility, that relationships work better when people are intellectual equals, and maybe I'd be happier with someone at my own level. My own level? I asked him what level that was, and he said in all seriousness, Melissa noticed I struggled with abstract concepts and relied too much on practical application. This woman, this absolute menace, had convinced my boyfriend that I was too dumb for him. I asked Nathan, my voice dangerously calm, if he agreed with her. He actually said she'd made some valid points about our conversations being surface level. Surface level? We had spent the entire week before discussing the philosophical implications of sending consciousness to Mars. But sure, surface level. I knew exactly what was happening. My mind was racing, plotting. But instead of confronting him then, I decided to play the long game. The very long game. I started acting confused when Nathan explained things. I'd ask Melissa to slow down when she talked. I even bought a bunch of pop science books and left them strategically around my apartment. Melissa ate it up. She started calling me Nathan's sweet, simple girlfriend. And I just smiled. Meanwhile, I was working on something special. See, Melissa's PhD advisor was Dr. Harrison. The same Dr. Harrison I'd collaborated with on 3 papers. He didn't even know she was friends with Nathan. I reached out to him casually about a new project involving quantum applications in satellite navigation. He was interested, and we started working together. Melissa had no idea her own advisor was sending me her research to review, because my practical experience could strengthen her theoretical work. Here's the thing about her research. It was derivative. She'd taken existing frameworks, repackaged them with incredibly dense math that only obscured, rather than illuminated. Her code was clunky. Her conclusions completely ignored real-world variables. I wrote a thorough, painstaking review, pointing out every single flaw, every miscitation, every place where practical application would tear her theories apart. Dr. Harrison was horrified. He'd completely missed it. Then I found something worse. So much worse. Whole paragraphs lifted, verbatim, from obscure Russian papers without attribution. Not enough to trigger standard plagiarism software, but enough to end a career. I documented everything, every single instance. I sent it all to Dr. Harrison with my deep concerns about academic integrity. He called me immediately. The review board met that week. Melissa walked in, probably thinking it was about her upcoming defense. Instead, they presented her with my findings. She tried to argue, to deny it, saying the similarities were coincidental. But I had found 17 instances across 4 separate papers. They pulled her funding on the spot. She had 2 weeks to clear out her office. Nathan called me, panicking. Melissa was having a breakdown, screaming that someone had sabotaged her. She couldn't figure out who. Apparently, she'd made enemies of most grad students by constantly correcting them. Nathan, bless his heart, asked if I could help, despite everything. I said, of course, my voice sweet as pie, and I went over, cookies and tea in hand. Melissa's office was a disaster. Stale coffee, printer toner, paper stacks everywhere. She was hunched over her desk, face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking. The tea I'd brought sat untouched. I settled into the plastic chair opposite her and just watched her cry. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. She kept repeating the same things. Someone set me up. The plagiarism is impossible. I never stole anything. I nodded, made sympathetic sounds, my hands gripping my knees under the desk. Every time she looked up at me with those red, swollen eyes, I had to fight to keep my face concerned, instead of the pure, unadulterated satisfaction I felt. This was exactly what I'd wanted, what I'd carefully planned and worked toward for weeks. But sitting there, watching her world collapse, it felt different than I'd expected. Not bad different, just strange. She wiped her nose and started going through the review board's findings again, pointing at her computer screen like I could help her find some error in their logic. I leaned forward, pretending to read the document I'd written myself for the very first time. She asked if I saw anything wrong with their conclusions. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "It looks pretty thorough." Her face crumpled again, and she buried her head in her hands. My phone buzzed. "Nathan, has Melissa said anything about who might have reported her?" I stared at the words, a cold dread creeping into my stomach. He had no idea. He was texting me his girlfriend for information, while I sat across from his friend, whose career I'd just obliterated. I typed back that she was too upset to talk coherently, which wasn't a lie, and suggested he give her space. He sent a worried face emoji. I put my phone away and looked at Melissa. She asked if I thought Nathan would still be friends with her. I told her, of course he would. This doesn't change who you are as a person. The words felt hollow, but she seemed to take comfort in them. She hugged me at the door. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without support right now." "You're a good friend," she added. The next week was a blur. Nathan kept texting me updates about Melissa, how she wasn't answering his calls, how worried he was. He said she was so proud, this must be killing her. I agreed, suggesting she just needed time. We were on his couch when he brought it up again, asking if he should drive over to her apartment. I told him that might make things worse, that she was probably too embarrassed to face anyone from her old life. He kept checking his phone. By Saturday, he was asking me repeatedly if she'd be okay, if academic fraud was something people recovered from. if her career was really over. I had to sit there, nodding, pretending to be equally concerned, while inside I felt this weird mix of triumph and guilt. The guilt surprised me. I had expected pure satisfaction, but her face in that tiny office, the way her hands had shaken. Monday morning, back at the lab, Kara found me pouring my third coffee. She asked if I was okay. I laughed it off, but she kept looking at me, concerned. "You seem different lately," she said, more confident, but also more guarded, like you're holding something back. Then she asked if everything was okay with Nathan. That question hit me like a ton of bricks. It was different, because suddenly I was thinking about what all of this had revealed about my relationship. Nathan had believed Melissa over me. He'd questioned my intelligence, my competence, my ability to understand concepts in my own damn field. He'd done it so easily, so quickly. 2 years of knowing me, just wiped away by a few weeks of Melissa's poisonous comments. I realized I hadn't processed any of that yet. I'd been so focused on destroying Melissa that I hadn't stopped to think about what it meant that Nathan was so ready to believe I was too dumb for him. Kara was still waiting for an answer. I told her, "Things with Nathan are complicated right now." She squeezed my shoulder and went back to her desk. That night, Nathan came over with takeout. Halfway through a documentary about deep-sea creatures, he paused it. His face was serious. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what Melissa had said regarding our intellectual compatibility. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. He continued, "I'm starting to wonder if maybe I'd been unfair to you." Unfair? I asked him what he meant. He shifted uncomfortably, mumbling about some of the things Melissa pointed out about you struggling with abstract concepts. Maybe, he added, those weren't actually true. Maybe I'd just been seeing what she wanted me to see. Anger surged through me, hot and sharp. He was only questioning his behavior now because Melissa had disappeared, not because he'd recognized the problem himself. Not because he'd thought about it and realized how insulting he'd been, but because his source of information was gone. I asked him if he actually believed I struggled with abstract concepts. He hesitated. "I don't know." Melissa was convincing. The anger boiled over. I asked if he remembered our conversation about consciousness and Mars exploration. He nodded. I asked if that had seemed surface level to him at the time, before Melissa told him it was. He looked down. "No," he admitted. I put my food down, stood up. Nathan asked where I was going. "Nowhere," I said. "I just need to move." I walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot. The decision formed in my mind, fully shaped, like it had been waiting there all along. I turned around. "I need to tell you something." He put his own food down, sitting forward, his eyes on me. Calmly, clearly, I explained how I'd reviewed Melissa's research for Dr. Harrison, how I'd found the plagiarism, how I'd documented everything that led to her getting kicked out of the PhD program. The words came out steady, chillingly precise. I told him about reaching out to Dr. Harrison, about the quantum navigation project being an excuse to get access to her work, about finding the lifted paragraphs from Russian papers. I explained how I had written the review that destroyed her career, how I had been the one who reported her. Nathan's face went completely white. He stared at me like I'd just confessed to murder. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, his voice quiet, trembling with shock, he asked, "Why would you do something so destructive?" I walked back to the couch and sat down, leaving a deliberate space between us. I reminded him of the router incident, when he'd asked if I really knew what I was doing. The code review, where he'd checked my work with Melissa, even though I'd been programming longer than she had. The company party, where she'd called me a lab tech, where she'd laughed at the idea that I could have written that thermal management paper. The car ride home, when he'd told me I'd be happier with someone at my own level. I went through every single time he'd questioned my intelligence, based on her lies. Each instance came out of my mouth like a piece of irrefutable evidence in a trial. His face got paler with every example. When I finished, he tried to say something, but I held up my hand. I asked him about the trivia night, where he'd agreed we should give other teams a chance because I probably just memorized facts. He closed his mouth, looking down at his hands. He tried to defend himself, stammering about Melissa being convincing and having a PhD, that she seemed like an authority on intellectual matters. I cut him off. My 2 master's degrees weren't convincing enough. I asked, my voice rising. My published research papers weren't authority enough? 6 years in aerospace engineering wasn't proof enough that I understood abstract concepts. My voice was loud now, echoing in the room. Did you need Melissa to tell you I was smart, Nathan? Or should you have figured that out from dating me for 2 years? The hurt on his face was obvious. He looked like I'd slapped him. Good. He was finally understanding the depth of what he'd done to our relationship. He opened his mouth, then closed it. No words. I waited. Finally, he said, I don't know what to say. Hearing it all laid out like that, I realized how badly I messed up. It wasn't just that you messed up, I told him. It was that you were so easily convinced I was incompetent, that some woman you hadn't seen since high school could show up and, within weeks, make you doubt my basic intelligence. Then he asked it, was the plagiarism real, or did you make it up to destroy her? The question made me so angry I had to take a deep breath before answering. I was genuinely offended that he was still doubting my professional integrity, even now. I got up, went to my laptop, opened my email, and pulled up the files I'd sent Dr. Harrison. I showed him the original Russian papers, side by side with Melissa's work, pointed out the identical paragraphs, the same sentence structures, the lifted equations. I walked him through all 17 instances, showed him how she'd changed just enough words to avoid automatic detection, but kept the core ideas without attribution. I made him read the passages himself, comparing them line by line. I watched his face as he realized her fraud was completely real, that I hadn't fabricated anything, that I'd just done my job as a reviewer and found what was actually there. He sat back, hands over his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should never have questioned whether you'd made it up. I closed my laptop. The plagiarism was real, I said, but that doesn't change why I looked for it in the first place. We spent the next 3 hours talking. Nathan apologized over and over, saying he didn't know how he'd let himself get manipulated. He admitted he'd gotten caught up in Melissa's confidence and his own insecurity about not having a PhD. He'd always felt like maybe he wasn't smart enough, that his consulting work was less impressive than research. Melissa had played right into that fear, making him feel included in some elite intellectual club by agreeing with her assessment of me. I listened to all of it, trying to figure out if I could forgive someone so easily convinced I was incompetent. Part of me understood that insecurity makes people do stupid things, but another part couldn't stop thinking about how quickly he'd turned on me. He asked what I was thinking. I told him I didn't know yet. I needed time to process everything, to figure out if trust could be rebuilt after something like this. He nodded. I understand. I'll wait as long as you need. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the documentary still paused, the takeout containers cold on the coffee table. I left Nathan's place after midnight, my hand shaking on the steering wheel, the conversation replaying in my head. When I got home, I sat on the couch in the dark for an hour, just trying to process. The next morning, I texted Nathan that I needed space. He responded immediately, asking how much time. I told him honestly, I don't know. He showed up at my door that evening, 2 boxes in his hands, looking pale and tired. He'd packed his things from my apartment without me even having to ask. His spare clothes, his extra toiletries, the book he'd been reading on my nightstand. He moved quietly, carefully. When he finished, he stood in my doorway, holding both boxes. Is this really what you want? He asked. It's what I need right now, I told him. He nodded. left without arguing. After he was gone, I walked through my apartment, noticing the empty spaces. The bathroom counter looked bigger. The closet had a gap. And weirdly, the apartment felt more like mine than it had in months. Like I'd been sharing it with someone who didn't really see me. And now I had room to breathe again. 3 days later, I was at work when an email from Dr. Harrison popped up. He thanked me for the thorough review of Melissa's research, said my attention to detail had been invaluable. Then he mentioned that 2 other graduate students had come forward with concerns about collaborative projects they'd worked on with Melissa. Apparently, my review had opened up a bigger investigation into her entire academic career. I stared at that email. Part of me felt satisfied, like I'd exposed something that needed exposing. But another part felt guilty, knowing I'd triggered this whole thing. If I hadn't gone looking, if I hadn't been so angry, would anyone have ever found the plagiarism? Would those other students have spoken up? I closed my email, but I couldn't stop thinking about how one review had destroyed someone's entire career path. That Friday, Kara found me still at my desk at 7 p.m. "Drinks?" she asked. I said yes. We ended up at a bar near the lab. After we ordered, Kara asked what was going on because I'd seemed off all week. I hadn't planned to tell anyone, but it all came spilling out. Melissa undermining me, Nathan believing her, finding the plagiarism, the investigation, everything. I expected Kara to be shocked or maybe judge me. Instead, she listened carefully, then said, "You didn't fabricate anything. You just exposed fraud that would have been discovered eventually. Melissa's treatment of you was its own kind of sabotage." She pointed out that if the plagiarism was real, Melissa had done this to herself. I'd just been the one who found it. Hearing someone else say that made me feel slightly better. The next Tuesday, Nathan texted, asking if we could talk again. He said he'd been thinking a lot about his behavior and realized the problem wasn't just about Melissa. He admitted he'd always felt intimidated by my practical skills and hands-on expertise. That insecurity had made him vulnerable when someone came along claiming theoretical knowledge was superior. He wanted to talk more if I was willing. I stared at the text for an hour. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part needed to understand. I agreed to meet him for coffee that Saturday. When I got to the coffee shop, Nathan was already there at a corner table. He had a notebook in front of him, which seemed weird. After we ordered, he slid the notebook across to me. He'd written out a list of every time he remembered questioning my intelligence or abilities over the past 6 months. There were way more instances than I'd realized. Times he'd asked if I was sure about something technical. Moments where he'd double-checked my work. Conversations where he'd explained things I already knew. Some of them I'd completely forgotten about because they'd seemed small at the time. But seeing them all written out together showed a pattern that had started way before Melissa showed up. She hadn't created the problem. She just made it worse. I read through the list, feeling that mix of hurt and anger build again. Nathan watched me, silent. Then he asked if I thought we could fix this, or if the damage was too deep. We spent the next 2 hours talking about the foundation of our relationship and whether it had ever been as solid as I'd thought. Nathan acknowledged his serious insecurity issues about not having a PhD, about doing consulting instead of research. He'd always worried he wasn't smart enough compared to people doing theoretical work. When Melissa came along, alking about abstract concepts, it had made him feel included. Agreeing with her assessment of me had been a way of proving he belonged in that space. I told him that was a pretty terrible reason to undervalue someone you supposedly loved. He agreed, said he knew it was messed up, that he needed to work on trusting his actual experiences with people instead of just believing whoever sounded the most confident or had the most credentials. I asked if he really thought he could change that pattern because it seemed deeply rooted. He said he didn't know, but he wanted to try if I was willing to give him a chance. I told him I needed more time to think about whether I could trust him again after this, whether knowing he'd been so easily convinced I was incompetent was something I could get past. We left the coffee shop without making any decisions about our future. That week I kept thinking. I realized I needed an outside perspective from someone who understood the professional side of what I'd done. I emailed Julian Lozano, my former professor from grad school, who I'd stayed in touch with. I explained the whole situation, how I'd found Melissa's plagiarism while reviewing her work for Dr. Harrison, and asked about the ethics of it all. Julian called me the next day. He listened to the full story, then said something that surprised me. He pointed out that exposing academic fraud was actually an ethical obligation for anyone who discovered it. Regardless of my personal reasons for looking closely at Melissa's work, finding and reporting plagiarism was the right thing to do. He said the academic system relied on people being honest. If I'd found the fraud and not reported it, that would have been the ethical problem. My motivations didn't change the fact that what I'd found was real and needed to be addressed. Talking to Julian helped me feel less guilty. 2 weeks after Nathan moved his stuff out, I got an email that made my stomach drop. It was from Melissa. The subject line just said, "I know it was you." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. Her email wasn't angry like I'd expected. Instead, it was defeated, sad. She'd figured out my connection to Dr. Harrison somehow, probably by going through his correspondence. She wrote that she understood now that I'd been the one who reviewed her work and found all the problems. But then she said something that really surprised me. She acknowledged the plagiarism was real, that she'd convinced herself the similarities to those Russian papers were just coincidental because the ideas seemed obvious to her. But when faced with all 17 instances laid out together, she couldn't deny it anymore. She said she'd gotten lazy and sloppy, taking shortcuts because she was behind on her research timeline. She knew it was wrong, but had convinced herself it wasn't that bad. The email ended with her saying she didn't blame me for reporting it, because it was the truth. I read that email 3 times, trying to figure out how I felt. Part of me had expected her to be furious, accusatory. This acceptance and acknowledgement of her own fraud was somehow harder to process. I didn't respond to Melissa's email, but I did forward it to Nathan. He needed to see that his friend had been both a fraud and someone who deliberately tried to destroy our relationship. He called me within 10 minutes. His voice was shaking. He kept apologizing again, saying he finally understood the full picture, that Melissa had manipulated him while being academically dishonest the whole time. He felt stupid for not seeing it earlier, for believing her over me. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I still didn't know what it meant for us. We talked for another hour. By the end of the call, Nathan asked if I'd be willing to try couples counseling. He said he recognized we had serious trust and communication problems that he couldn't fix on his own. He was always skeptical about therapy, but he agreed to try, and so did I. I still wasn't ready to completely give up on us. We started seeing a therapist the following week. The first session was awkward, uncomfortable. We sat on opposite ends of a beige couch, trying to explain what had brought us there. Over the next few sessions, she helped us identify patterns we'd both missed. She pointed out that Nathan's insecurity about his education and career had led him to undervalue practical expertise while overvaluing theoretical knowledge. That dynamic made our relationship vulnerable to someone like Melissa, who presented herself as intellectually superior. The therapist also made me look at my own behavior, how I'd chosen revenge instead of just confronting the problem directly, how I'd played into Melissa's perception of me as less intelligent instead of standing up for myself earlier. She said we both had work to do on communication and trust if we wanted to rebuild anything real. Nathan started working on his insecurity, learning to value different kinds of intelligence. I worked on being more direct, instead of letting resentment build until I did something destructive. It was slow progress. Some sessions were really hard, both of us getting defensive, upset. But gradually, things started feeling a little better between us. 3 months passed. Things with Nathan got better, but different. We talked more about what we were feeling instead of just assuming. When I felt hurt, I told him right away. When he felt insecure, he actually said so, instead of taking it out on me indirectly. But there was this new carefulness between us that hadn't been there before. Like we were both watching for signs that the other person might doubt us again. I caught myself sometimes, waiting to see if he'd question my judgment. And I could tell he was doing the same, watching to see if I was angry or planning something. It wasn't bad, exactly, just different from the easy trust we used to have. We were building something more honest, but it took more work. Then my boss called me into her office. I thought I'd made some mistake on the satellite component testing. Instead, she told me they were promoting me to senior engineer, a significant raise, my own team, leading the next generation navigation systems project. I sat there, stunned. I'd been so focused on Nathan and Melissa, I hadn't even realized the promotion cycle was happening. My boss said the decision was easy. My published research and technical contributions over the past year had been outstanding. I thanked her, walked back to my desk, feeling this weird mix of pride and relief. That night, I told Nathan. He immediately pulled me into a hug, said he was so proud. He insisted on a celebration dinner that weekend, inviting a bunch of our friends and coworkers. At the dinner, he kept telling people about my research papers and technical expertise without me even bringing it up. He'd mention specific projects, explain why they were important. It felt like a test we were both passing. Him, showing he valued my work. Me, letting him celebrate my success without wondering if he had ulterior motives. A few weeks after that, Kara pulled me aside at work. She had this uncomfortable look on her face. She'd heard something through academic networks about Melissa. Apparently, she'd left the PhD program completely, not just taking time off, but actually withdrawing. She'd moved back to her hometown in Ohio to work in her family's commercial real estate business. Kara said she thought I should know, since the whole situation had been so messy. I felt this complicated knot in my stomach. Part of me felt satisfied. Melissa had faced real consequences for her fraud, for trying to destroy my relationship. She'd been exposed as a fake and lost the career she'd been so smug about. But another part of me felt uncomfortable with how completely her life had fallen apart. I'd exposed real plagiarism and bad research. That was true, but I'd also done it specifically to hurt her. The severity of her fall, losing everything she'd worked toward and having to leave academia entirely, it felt heavier than I'd expected. I thanked Kara and went back to work, but I kept thinking about it for days. Nathan and I talked about Melissa that weekend. I told him what Kara had said. Admitted I felt weird about it. He said he understood why I'd done what I did, and that Melissa had brought the consequences on herself through her own dishonesty. But he also said he knew I probably felt conflicted about being the one who'd triggered everything. We decided to keep working on our relationship, to stay together, to keep going to therapy and build something more honest than what we'd had before. Both of us had changed. I knew now that I was capable of calculated revenge, of planning someone's downfall in a deliberate way, and that was uncomfortable knowledge to have about myself. Nathan knew he was capable of betraying someone he loved, not through deliberate cruelty, but through weakness and insecurity, letting someone else manipulate his perceptions. We were building something more real than the easy rhythm we used to share. It was harder work, less comfortable, but it felt more solid somehow, like we actually knew who we were now, and were choosing each other anyway, despite our flaws, despite our capacity for hurting each other. The weariness was still there, but so was something deeper. So, what do you think? Was my revenge justified? Have you ever had to choose between letting something go or fighting back in a way that changed you forever? Let me know in the comments below. I really want to hear your thoughts.